Так, ну я пока... Итак, смотрим, появились ли мы в стриме. А вот смотри, все люди уже что пишут, значит, мы в стриме. Да. Okay, Peter. Welcome to our stream.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Yeah. So, Peter, there's quite a complicated question. I wanted to start with it because I really wanted to ask it for quite a long time. As far as you are responsible for the sound of the speakers of very different brands, at least 3 of them, which I know very well, and I love the sound, and the sound is totally different from brand to brand, and still the sound maintains totally in each brand. So the question is, how do you manage to keep a different sound in different brands, and still it's one guy who is doing that?
It's not so much a different sound. I grew up with these brands, so I've in fact my first home built loudspeakers were based on Wharfedale drive units. I've also worked for Mission and also done some work with Quad. So over the years, I built up if you like, an audio knowledge of what each brand should sound like, its characteristics. And it's not so much that it's a different sound, it's more that it's a different character that appeals to a specific type of customer. Exactly.
So how technically do you reach the certain character of the speaker? And if finally you can maybe describe somehow the character of the different brands that you're doing the speakers for.
Well, a lot of the reason for the character of these brands comes from the people behind the brands. So if we take Quad, for example, Peter Walker was always concerned with accuracy. You know, he'd not only worked in his spare time in dance bands, but he was also playing flute in orchestra. So he knew very well the correct sound of instruments, and he was always wanted to reproduce the correct sound of instruments. So with Quad, accuracy is an absolute necessity. And at the same time of that, of course, we have to bring in musicality, which is an important part of every musician's life. So it's achieving that character of absolute accuracy, making instruments sound completely real, as well as bringing in the musicality and enjoyment of the performance that really matters with Quad.
What about Wharfedale? Peter, how do you actually properly pronounce the name of this brand? Wharfedale?
Wharfedale, yes.
Wharfedale. Ну, короче говоря, in Russian it is much easier to pronounce every word, every letter in the word. That's why we sound a bit weird in this case. But okay. Да, это мы сейчас, значит, тут пошутили насчет произношения бренда Wharfedale. У нас принято Wharfedale говорить, хотя, конечно, если по-английски, то это Wharfedale, Wharfedale. Okay. Wharfedale.
Wharfedale.
Да, поэтому Wharfedale, the Russian way. Okay, Peter, so what about the character of Wharfedale?
Well, you have to remember with Wharfedale that Gilbert Briggs first started making loudspeakers almost, not really as a commercial enterprise, but really to satisfy his own needs. Only 7 years after the Rice-Kellogg moving coil loudspeaker patent. So it was, you know, this was Rice-Kellogg started the moving coil loudspeaker in 1925, and Briggs started making loudspeakers in 1932. So his first customers were people who were trying to get a good sound out of the radio sets of their day. Now, again, if we look slightly into the future, Gilbert Briggs was also an amateur pianist. So again, he knew what the sound of that instrument should be like. And I think his main listening to his early loudspeakers, his main interest was to bring across the maximum enjoyment of music. Accuracy did start to come into it later on when he was doing live versus recorded demonstrations. But initially, it was mainly about tone. It was mainly about reproducing the tonal qualities of an instrument in an enjoyable way. And that really, leads the character of Wharfdale.
So, Peter, the next question is if we started moving to this character thing. Of course, my interest lies on the retro speakers that you're now establishing with Wharfdale, and I really love them. The latest, the Denton 80 was outstanding. Denton 85 is just, one of my favorite speakers generally. And then there's Linton. But the question is, I never heard the original Dentons or Lintons. So the sound of the new ones, does it come close to the old ones? Does it resemble it somehow, or it totally differently?
The character is there, but the sound is very much up to date. If you go, we all, I think, tend to look through rose-tinted spectacles and remember what things were like in all our early hi-fi systems. And I'm afraid that I've put together some of those early hi-fi systems, and compared by today's standards, they're sadly lacking. However, what I'm relying on is the character of sound that I experienced. I used to sell Dentons and Lintons, so I know the sound very well, know the character very well. And what I wanted to do was to bring back something that I think is missing from a lot of modern speakers, and that is fullness of sound. And we've lost it because speakers have become too small. When I was growing up, a small bass unit was 10 inches. A typical bass unit size was 12 inches. A typical mid-range was 8 inches. So like going down to the sort of typically now you see speakers with 5-inch drive unit, and very narrow baffles and very small cabinets. You cannot get that fullness of sound that would have been experienced by owners of the original Denton and Linton without going back to larger drive units and bigger cabinets.
Okay, there's always a lot of interest from the audience about the speaker systems and the electronics that you use for your home listening or for your test listening. So what kind of speakers or electronics are you using now? What's on your around?
Okay, well, for speakers, I'm always using what I'm working on.
I see.
Like my customers, I have to live with my speakers. And by living with your speakers, you really begin to understand, what when you're developing them, what the problems are, as well as what are the good points. I won't release a speaker design until I can happily live with it. So that's it for speakers. In terms of electronics, I don't have anything too fancy. I have some quad electronics and some Audiolab electronics that I use depending on the price of the speakers that I'm developing. So the more expensive speakers I'll put with more expensive amplifiers. But it makes no sense for me to develop cheap speakers on expensive amplifiers, because that's not how they're going to be used. So I tend to try and match the electronics to the class of speaker that I'm developing.
There's a question about the ribbon tweeters, if they are ribbon tweeters, if you use them, or the AMT. I'm not sure about that. So tell us about them, and tell us if there's any difference between the tweeters that you use and it's quite a lot of ribbon tweeters used in all over the world in different speakers. So is there anything special about the ones that you employ in your speakers?
Well, I've been fascinated by ribbon treble units for a very long time, but it used to be that you could not use them for high-powered applications that we now have because they're so fragile. But over the past decade, there's been a tremendous advances in much more robust ribbon diaphragms. So the ribbon treble units that we use for quad are based on that type of technology. It's a sandwich material that's used in the ribbon, and we worked with existing manufacturer to produce them to as my specific requirements. I wanted a very wide bandwidth from these ribbon units, so that's what you'll find in quad. Now, as far as the AMT design that we use in Wharfdale, that's a very special development that we make in our own factory. And again, the AMT is something that's fascinated me for a very long time. But of course, we weren't able to use it because of patent rights by the German inventor. But now those patent rights have run out. So, at last we can get our hands on this technology, and it's an absolutely fascinating technology to use. Because both with the ribbon and with the AMT, the transient performance you get and the transient accuracy you get is far better than you get from a dome.
Okay, there's a conceptual and at the same time technical question, again about the character of the sound. And if we talk about Wharfdale, okay, we can say that there is a concept of emotional sound, maybe, yeah. If I did understand you right from the first point of our conversation, but technically, if you say, yeah, we're talking about the translating the emotions, but how do you translate them? Is there a crossover scheme that you should use to make a speaker emotional? Is there a special driver that makes a speaker emotional? How do you manage to get exactly this kind of character in Wharfdale?
Okay, so I think we have to go back to what is music really all about and how is it formed. So I discovered, I used to review for hi-fi magazines, and I was one of the first reviewers to talk about musicality in terms of hi-fi. And if you talk to musicians about musicality, what they really mean is getting through to what the performer and what the composer originally intended. So obviously it's quite difficult to get through to what the composer originally intended.
Oh yeah.
But certainly you can get through to what the performer intended when he was performing the piece. And the language of music is something that affects our emotions directly. It's not a sound. It is an expression of translation of what the composer put down on paper into something that we hear and enters our brains and gives us that feeling. So if we're not doing that with a hi-fi system, then there's something going wrong. So when we consider what music consists of, it consists, of course, of musical phrases, the notes, and more importantly, the transient information that is created by the instruments, and it consists of silences. And the silences are equally as important. The gaps between the notes are unbelievably important to the timing. So those transients and the gaps between them gives you the timing of the music. In addition, you have the sound of the instruments, which is relayed by the harmonics. So you have to get all those things right. And it turns out that in a loudspeaker, there is no one thing which gives you the answer. It has to be a balance between absolutely everything that is in the construction of the loudspeaker. So the drive units, the cabinet, the way the whole thing is mechanically put together, and most importantly, the crossover, which blends the drive units together. And if you get the crossover right, that balance and blend of tonality will give you the musicality of the piece.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So did I get it right that the crossover is the point where you can tune the speaker and make it sound differently in character, or was I too fast in judgment?
No, that's absolutely right. Somebody, one of our salespeople asked me the other day when I played a prototype speaker for the first time, and there was obviously something wrong with it, which is fine. I need people to criticize me, to tell me what's wrong. And he said, well, don't you just make a flat frequency response? And I said, well, actually, every crossover that I produce has nearly a flat frequency response. But to give you an idea, on the speakers I'm working on now, I'm currently up to crossover number 21. Each of those 21 crossovers had a flat frequency response, and I can promise you that each one sounds completely different. So the crossover is unbelievably important in a loudspeaker. And there's the other thing I would like to say is that as hi-fi enthusiasts, we tend to get hung up on technical specification of everything. Whereas really technical specification is only of interest to the designer, because it means nothing in terms of how you appreciate the performance of what you're listening to.
I love it. So there's of course a question which is quite obvious, and it is all about the headphones in these days. So are you going to make some headphones, and do you ever try to make headphones, and is it the experience of doing speakers helps you to do that? So any headphones from Wharfdale, made by Peter Comeau?
We don't have any plans for Wharfdale headphones at the moment, but I did work hard with I didn't design them myself, but I did work hard on tuning the sound of the Quad Era 1 headphones, because that was something that was very dear to my heart, to make something which resembled an electrostatic, but which you clamped to the side of your head. That was absolutely fascinating. And in terms of, it's a very, very different technology to the way that you would design a loudspeaker. You actually don't want a flat frequency response from headphones, because you're clamping something directly over your ears. You actually have to have a very peculiar looking frequency response in order to get what sounds like a flat performance, like an accurate performance.
So we have actually two questions now. Let's start. Let's start with my one, which is we already started to talk about the measurements a little bit, but I wanted to talk a bit more about the case, because there's always a lot of talking around this. And so the question is, how important are the measurements for you as a developer of the speaker, and what exact measures are really valuable, and what of them are not really serious, what are valuable for you? And after all, what is more important, having good numbers, or taking a listen and have just your ear experience? Let me say that.
Okay, so the first commercial loudspeakers that I developed for the first year of the design. I developed without using any measurements at all. But it took us 18 months before we got that speaker into production. And it taught me a lesson, because in the last 6 months, we started using measurements, and then we really had to learn how to use those measurements and apply them to what we were hearing. Mm-hmm. So a large proportion of that 6 months was learning how to do that. And after that, I thought, I now have a method that I can use to develop loudspeakers. And it's actually, nowadays, it's a 3-way, what I call iteration. Do you understand the word iteration?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure.
So we start off with measurements, which gives us a starting point for our first design, our first prototype. We model that in software, and then we can put a prototype together that we can listen to. And then we hear what's wrong. We go back to the measurements, make some changes to solve the problems that we can hear. And we go back to the software to help us refine those changes. And then we produce another prototype and listen again. And using that iteration, we might spend sometimes like 100 to 500 hours going through that process of measurement, software development, and listening before we even start to get something that sounds reasonably good. So it's a very fine balance between what you predict using the software, what you can measure, and what you can hear. But at least it enables me to design a pair of loudspeakers in 2 weeks instead of 2 years.
Okay. And the other part of this question is, of course, from the side of the listener. So when you're, especially these days, it's important because people are more and more try to buy online. Never really listen to speakers, or never really see them literally. So how do we should we consider the measurements and the numbers which companies give us with the speakers? Can we really be sure about them, and be sure to buy some speakers just regarding the numbers we have about them? Or the only way to buy proper speakers is to listen to?
The only thing that matters in terms of the numbers is the sensitivity of the speaker and the power of the amplifier that it's going to be put with. Everything else is virtually meaningless. You can get an idea of how deep the bass will go by looking at the bass extension. But even so, that gives you no idea about how the bass will sound in your room. You can get an idea of how extended the high frequency performance is, but again, it'll give you no idea how that will sound in your room. So all the other measurements, all the other numbers in the specifications, we have to give them because hi-fi enthusiasts are interested in them. But for me, they are as meaningless for speakers as they are for amplifiers, as they are for CD players, as they are for streaming devices.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry about that. You know, I'd like it to be different, but it isn't. Can I give you a couple of examples?
Еще несколько примеров хочешь привести, Питер? Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah. So if we look at what most people think is a guide to the performance of a loudspeaker, which is its frequency response, the frequency response is only taken with the microphone in one position. In your room, you hear the sound that the speaker produces in all directions. In other words, you're listening to the power response of the speaker. And there is no specification for the power response of the loudspeaker. So it turns out that the best sounding loudspeakers have a similar characteristic of sound off axis as they do on axis in the typical microphone position. That's because the sound that's reflected off the walls and the ceiling and the floor all come to your ears together with the direct sound from the speaker, and they make up the performance of the loudspeaker. If the performance of the loudspeaker is different in different axes, then the loudspeaker will sound wrong.
Other examples?
Yeah, the other example, this is really something that I continually try and teach people about, and that is distortion. You know, when people are looking at amplifiers and electronics, they're always fascinated by the lowest distortion. When I talk to amplifier designers, they're always chasing 0% distortion. And yet, we have, as human beings, we've done many experiments which indicate that in terms of harmonic distortion, and I must stress harmonic distortion, you cannot hear harmonic distortion below 1%. So why are we so hung up on this? It goes back to the early days of advertising amplifiers, it turns out. Nobody ever talks about distortion in loudspeakers. Why not? Because typically distortion in loudspeakers is in the order of 1 to 3%. You know, if we started publishing those figures in our specifications, nobody would buy our loudspeakers because they're all hung up on distortion. They're all fascinated by distortion. What really matters is the non-harmonic distortion. Loudspeakers, thankfully, usually produce harmonic distortion, the majority of which is second and third harmonic, which is fairly innocuous to our ears. We're quite comfortable with that. Tube amplifiers do the same thing. Semiconductor amplifiers produce all sorts of other strange noises which are not harmonically related. And yes, those have to be very small percentage amounts, otherwise they annoy us. But really, you know, this number for distortion, just taken by itself, is meaningless.
Значит, давай еще, any other examples, Peter, in this case?
Oh, loads, but I don't want to bore everybody with technicality.
No, it's totally, it's outstanding. We're discussing it. There's a huge amount of comments on the chat about this. People are excited. So yeah, that's what we wanted you to be here for. Exactly. To discuss those numbers and fake numbers and all those stuff. Yeah, that's beautiful. So yeah, okay, Peter, there's a lot of comments about this, exactly the power response of the speaker. So honestly, I don't totally understand what is it and can't translate it properly because people are a bit confused. So if you could somehow describe more of this characteristic. So power response, what is it? What does it consist of?
Okay, so if we're talking about the usual published frequency response is directly in line with the speaker at ear level. Because that, you know, if you're measuring something, you have to produce some sort of graph which indicates what is happening at the point at the listening axis.
Yeah, on axis, yeah.
That defines the initial sound which reaches your ears. But after that, very shortly after that, you get the sound which comes out of the speaker about 30 degrees in a 30-degree arc from the main speaker, and that is reflected off the side walls of the room. And that is the next sound that you get. And then after that, you get the sound reflected from the ceiling and the sound reflected from the floor. And all those responses add together to give you the power response to the loudspeaker. And what you usually find is that the sound that goes to the side of the room is reduced in very high frequency output. So if you have a loudspeaker which has a response which is falling in the treble, it will tend to sound a little dull when you put it in a typical listening room because its power response is poor in the high frequency region. Similarly, when you listen to when you go to a concert and you hear real instruments, one of the things that, well, it always hits me anyway, is the power of the bass from
Hmm.
instruments like grand piano and cello, as well as obviously percussion instruments like drums, because they are generating a huge power response. When people make recordings, they tend to use big loudspeakers, so they tend to balance the sound to give to match those big loudspeakers. But when we listen at home, if we're listening with small loudspeakers, we don't get that impression.
Hmm.
Now, if you go and play something like the Wharfdale Linton, because it's a big loudspeaker, it will give you that impression. But for a small loudspeaker, its power response in the bass is much worse than indicated by its frequency response.
Hmm.
Very often, you have to kick up the bass response of a small
Oh,
loudspeaker.
I see.
You look at all the small, successful bookshelf loudspeakers, they all have a rising bass response in the region of 120 to 80 hertz,
Hmm.
because that's the way that they're going to generate that level of power in the room.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay,
Да,
okay.
можно?
Uh,
Давай.
да, да, давай. Значит, okay, Peter, we actually, yeah, we're nearly at the end of our stream, but still there are quite a lot of questions waiting. So if it's okay, so we could follow for more couple of minutes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Then there's a question, of course, about the most obvious thing on Warfordale speakers, which is the Kevlar driver, if it's Kevlar. So, well, people love different materials, especially the paper cones. So why do you use exactly this one? And what is special about it? What's the reason to use it for you?
Well, we can, I mean, there are all sorts of materials that we can use in loudspeakers.
Yeah.
It turns out that most of the high tensile woven materials can be used to give a, a specific shape of cone, which gives a good performance. The I also love using paper, but I think paper has it has particular problems for the developer. One of those is that it takes a long time and it's very expensive to make a new tool for a paper cone.
Oh, really?
So if you're trying to experiment with paper cones, you
Hmm.
really have to spend years doing it. Whereas with the plastic materials like polypropylene or with woven materials, you can make a cone former very easily out of cheap materials to try out different shapes and different sizes. Um, Different formulations are very easy to come up with. And in the loudspeaker industry, we tend to look for materials which are very consistent over the years. We don't want,
Hmm.
our loudspeakers to sound different one year after another. So we're looking for materials which are used elsewhere in other industries. So polypropylene, for example, is used a lot in the catering industry. So that's a nice material to use because it's obviously in full production all the time. The packing industry also has various plastics which we can use. The nice thing about Kevlar is that it's used for a huge variety of things, for everything from bulletproof vests through to other high tensile clothing. So for the
Hmm.
clothing industry, Kevlar is produced in vast amounts, and that means it's very consistent. Over the
Hmm.
years, we can maintain its performance. We always know what we're buying.
Hmm.
Um, and in terms of its use for Wharfdale, we've been working with Masistis material for a long time. We know how to get the best performance out of it. So it's very much a traditional thing of working with something that you're familiar with and you're comfortable with.
Hmm.
Что флагманская новая
Okay, Peter,
серия.
there's another question about the Elysium, uh, the flagship, as far as I could get from the Wharfdale. So, uh, just the general thing. What's the idea behind this line, and how do you consider them to fit in the hi-fi market these days?
Well, we wanted to do something, let's say, higher end for Wharfdale. Although I think if when we talk to our American cousins, it's not high end at all. Of course,
Too cheap, too cheap.
For them it's too cheap. It's mid price. But for Wharfdale, it's high end. We wanted to do something because Wharfdale, in its tradition, has always had a high-end loudspeaker. If you go back to Gilbert Briggs' time, he had the Airedale, which was an extremely expensive loudspeaker for its time. And of course, once you start being able to spend more money in terms of materials and in terms of development, then you can use better performing drive units, more advanced. I mean, the AMT that we developed for Elysium is really, really very extraordinary, and I would say groundbreaking in the way that we've designed it, because we've used a very, very light material. Whereas previously all the AMTs have used quite heavy materials, but we wanted to go after, we were really chasing that very, very precise transient response that an AMT can give. And for us, that was the way to do it. And also, the cabinet techniques that we can use in a more expensive loudspeaker, the performance of the mechanical parts of the loudspeaker in terms of the chassis of the drivers and so on, the quality of crossover components that we can put in, everything adds together to make a better performing loudspeaker. And I'm very, very pleased with the way it turned out. I'm absolutely delighted by the very positive reviews that we've been getting all over the world, and also by the responses of our customers too. It gives me great joy to introduce Elysium to you, because I think it's just remarkable what we've achieved within its price range. We didn't want it to be outrageously expensive. We wanted, as always with Wharfdale, to make something that was affordable, but which achieved high-end performance.
Well, Peter, it was a pleasure to talk to you. I think it's now time to finish. There's still a couple of questions, but we deal with them. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for letting me talk to your listeners. It's a great privilege for me to be able to talk to Russians. I'd love to be there with you, but this is as good a way of doing it in this difficult times as any.
Hopefully the difficult times will come to an end, and we'll meet hopefully in Moscow. Welcome, please join us sometime. Окей, в общем, Питер сказал: спасибо, ребята, очень приятно было поговорить с русской аудиторией, потому что когда еще такое случится, к сожалению, сидим на локдауне. Ну, а я от себя сказал, что и локдаун закончится, Петюха, приезжай к нам в Москву, загуляем. Вот, so thank you once again.
Welcome to Moscow.
Yeah. Now you can turn off your translation. Translation. It's what I'm doing. Okay. Thank you. You can turn off the Zoom thing, and we'll go continue here with some advertisement stuff. Thank you once again.
Bye.
Bye. Good luck.
Bye bye.